I want to welcome you all to our second speaker in the School of Business and Economics speaker series, who's going to be introduced by my colleague, Professor Philip Bose, who is Associate Professor of Economics in the school and is managing the speaker series for us. So, I mean, it's a great day to be a Red Wolf, great day for the School of Business and Economics, and I'm going to hand things over to Philip.
All right. I want to introduce the speaker. I met Dr. Hill 6 years ago, I think, at a conference. That's how I ran into him, and I invited him to my previous places of work. So I thought he'd be a great speaker here. Dr. Hill is a Professor of Economics Emeritus at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. He's also the Senior Fellow of the Property and Environment Research Center in Bozeman, Montana. He also owned a ranch in Bozeman, Montana, where he'll talk about his ranch in a speech today. He has written many books and papers in areas such as property rights, the theory of property rights, institutional economics, and environmental economics. He does have a link to Indiana. His first teaching job was in Purdue University, which is where that's his link to Indiana. We are thankful for the Koch Foundation for sponsoring this talk, and this is also sponsored by the Delta Mu Delta, the IU East Center for Economic Education, and IU East Business and Economic Research Center. Please put your cell phones on quiet, okay, on the silence mode, and please join me in welcoming Dr. P.J. Hill.
Someone mentioned that I turned off my cell phone. Hopefully be in good shape for all those sorts of things. So, thank you for the chance to be here. We're going to talk about the American West and a little bit about my part in the West. I'm an economic historian, so I think about the West, but I'll tell you a little bit about why I'm interested in the West. This is my maternal grandfather, Peter Jensen. He was a Danish immigrant, and he rode his horse from Denver to Montana in 1892. All the possessions that he owned in the world were tied on the back of his saddle. He worked on a ranch for 2 years, and then he started our ranch, which was the PJ Ranch, in 1894, and that's the family ranch that I operated for much of my life, while I tried to combine that with an academic career, which for a somewhat confusing world. This is my grandmother, Charlotte Jensen. She came to Montana in 1902 to teach school. She went to school in Missouri, and it's interesting to listen to her story about how she met my grandfather. She says in 1907, this friend of hers rode 40 miles leading a saddle horse so that she could go to a ranch for a dance that was 50 miles away. Now, I'm a horsebacker, and I've ridden 50 miles. It's a long day, so I'm assuming they did that in 2 days. That was a 2-day trip rather than a single day of doing it. The interesting thing is, at that ranch, she met my grandfather, or at that dance. He'd also ridden 50 miles to go to a dance. You might imagine they were somewhat socially deprived if they were riding horseback 50 miles to go to a social event. They were married. They went back, took the train back to LaBelle, Missouri, my grandmother's family home, to get married. They were married in 1908. And this is what I think is interesting. My mother is Mary Frances Jensen. When my grandmother became pregnant with her, she says 7 months before she saw another woman. She was living on the frontier. I took my wife from Michigan back to our ranch to live. This would send shivers up her spine when she talked about that. She thought it was pretty isolated when we went there, much less whatever it was back when my grandparents were there. I'm going to start out though. If you're doing a class, if you're doing something at an academic institution, you need to have a question. And so I'm going to ask you a question, and I hope you have a piece of paper, because I'm going to ask you to write down the answer to that question. I want you to tell me, how many bank robberies do you think there were in a whole list of Western states? I've given you the list of Western states, and I want the number of bank robberies. There's going to be a guess for that, and actually there's going to be a prize. I will autograph and give the person a copy of the Not So Wild Wild West book. Whoever can come to the seller can't guess, because he may have heard this one before. So, guess how many bank robberies in all those states? It's not quite all the western states. It's a large number of western states for 41 years, 1859 to 1900. Write a number down. How many bank robberies during that period of time? Yeah, you can write it on your hand if you don't have a piece of paper. So you got your number? Everybody got a number figured out? How many of you are between 500 and 1,000? Anybody in that range? What about more than 1,000 bank robberies? Okay. What about, okay, that's interesting. That's, it's a potential number of either word. Think about all the bank robberies. What about from 100 to 500, 100 to 499? Okay. What about from 50 to 100? Okay. What about less than 50? Okay, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. What's your number?
21.
21. Who else was it here? 5. 5?
I said 2.
How many?
2.
2. And let's see, wasn't there a fourth person?
Yeah, I said 10.
10? Actually, I think you get it. The number is 8 and between 8 and 12. So come up afterwards, and if you don't want the book, you can sell it on Amazon. You can actually find copies of my book there. One of the embarrassing things was that when Terry Anderson and I published the book, we sent copies, signed copies to people, some of our friends, colleagues that we thought might be interested in it. And then on the Amazon book list, a couple of years later, you would see autographed copy. Wondering which of my friends took my book and resold it. But now this is interesting. This actually comes from Larry Schweikert, who's actually a historian at the University of Dayton. And this is the whole period between 1859 and 1900. Now what's our usual image of the West? Well, there's these tough-looking cowboys, and they ride into town on their dust-covered slickers, even though it's the middle of the summer, and they tie their horses to the hitching post, hitching rail, and then they stomp into the bank, and they point their 6 guns at the towering teller that's behind the teller cage there and says, give us your money. And he puts all the money in the saddlebags, and of course they jump on their horses and they gallop out of town. The hapless sheriff finally gets a posse organized a few hours later, and they gallop off to try to chase the bank robbers, and they don't get them. But they succeed usually. And this is the story of the West, isn't it? There's violence, there's 6 guns, there's all of these sorts of things. How can there only be, and your number 10 may be the right number, how can there only be, 5 may be pretty good too. You can argue about that one. How can there be so few bank robberies during a period where everybody is armed and there's violence, all those sorts of things? Now remember, for a bank to exist, there needed to be a town, and actually putting in banks was one of the first things that towns in the West wanted to do because it was evidence of commercial activity and it was hard to protect your valuables. So when you got to be 500 or 1,000 people living in a town, sometimes only 300, they would establish a bank. Why didn't they get robbed more often? Well, what do you think was, so there would probably be 30 to 300 different businesses and homes there. What's behind the door or over the door of every household, every business?
Shotgun.
Shotgun or a rifle. What happens when the bank robbers ride into the bank and stomp in? Word goes to the town, doesn't it? The bank's being robbed. The bank's being robbed. When those guys get in the saddle and start to gallop out, what happens? They get shot out of the saddle. These aren't stupid people. They don't think this is a very good sort of an occupation to be involved in. So there were not very many bank robberies. Actually, there were more stagecoach robbers than what there were bank robbers because stagecoaches were a little easier to try to hold up. But what I want to talk about is the American West. And I want to ask the question, was it the Wild West? Is the picture of the bank robbery, the picture of anarchy, of chaos, does that really characterize the West? It was a period without a lot of formal government for much of the period of the American West. There wasn't a huge government presence. So there was very different production conditions. There were hostile indigenous people, at least for some of the period of time. So did they find ways to produce things, or is the typical movie or book characterization, does it capture what was going on in the West? Charlie Russell, a famous painter, talks of this is a shoot up at a local saloon in northern Montana. The question is, does that capture things well? Anderson and I, in the book, say it is the not so wild, wild West. That is really not a story of chaos and anarchy and violence, but it's really a different story, really a story of institutional success and of the evolution of reasonably efficacious property rights. So, one of the interesting questions is, what about the native people? Because for the native peoples, the argument is that they didn't have property rights. It was kind of share and share alike. Well, it turns out this is a fish trap in the Pacific Northwest. These are salmon, and salmon live in the sea, and then they go up the streams to spawn every year in the Pacific Northwest. And this is a trap that's been organized by a particular tribe. Now, that's a pretty big capital investment when you're a subsistence economy. And so if you're going to put that in, you might want to get some sort of a return on it. They had markers that told you who that belonged to. One of the interesting things that fish biologists struggled with for a period of time is if you look at the salmon on the streams in the Pacific Northwest, there's very different sizes in those streams. Some salmon streams have very large salmon. Some streams have very small salmon. And for a while they were trying to figure it out in terms of fish ecology, fish biology. Was there something different about the food stock? Those sorts of things. And then some anthropologists started working on it, and what they discovered was, on the areas where tribes had very clear property rights, and they did have property rights to the streams, what would they do? Well, they understood fish husbandry, and if every year you're going to come back here, what would they choose in terms of the fish? Well, they decided maybe we should let some of the big salmon go upstream to spawn, and we don't want to take all of the big salmon, because we know something about the big salmon genetically give birth to other big salmon. It turns out that the streams with the small salmon are on the boundaries between tribal organizations, between tribes. And so you might own that stream for 1 year. In that sort of a case, what would you do? Well, you take all the salmon, you take the big salmon. But they very carefully husband their salmon because they knew that they would get a return on it. So they had a pretty well-defined system of property rights. Another interesting case, the hunting of bison. Now, first, of course, bison hunting is what we call pedestrian, on foot. And that's a much tougher job. There was a buffalo jump close to my ranch. I've gone there and hiked around, actually rode my horse in from the backside. It's a big bluff, and I've wondered about how hard it was to get bison to run over a bluff. It existed for several thousand years, and so they must have been fairly successful. But once they got the horse, remember the horse came to North America with the Spaniards starting around 1700, and then they kept moving north, and the tribes kept getting more and more horses. The ownership of the horse moved northward at 50 to 100 miles every 10 years. I've ridden some pretty good horses over some pretty rough ground, and I will tell you, I would be terrified doing that. You're riding a horse in the middle of a bison herd, and this person is trying to stick that lance into that bison while they're going at a full gallop. These guys are back here, this is also a Charlie Russell painting, are trying to do the same sort of a thing with their bows and arrows. Now, think about that. Is this a share and share alike economy? This is an economy where everybody goes out and, the macho men go out and they hunt the bison, and then everybody else comes along and skins them, and, well, just everybody's all together. Well, if you were in that situation, I know if I were in that situation, I'd go out there with my buddies and we'd be galloping along, and then at the end of the hunt I'd say, gosh guys, I'm sure glad you got a bison. I just never quite got in the herd. I was galloping along and I thought the herd was going to turn right, so I steered my horse, reined my horse right, and lo and behold, the herd went left. And I'm sure glad it's share and share alike, because you guys got bison and I get an equal share of that. Not true. This lance has a very specific marking on it. That lance belongs to that hunter. The arrows that this guy is shooting and the arrows that this guy is shooting are marked specifically for those hunters. It's what economists would call an incentive-compatible sort of a system. And then when they got done with the hunt, the person that had killed the bison got a double or a triple portion out of the hunt. Because they knew there were risks involved, they knew that it would be wise to try to encourage people to take particular actions with regard to the bison, and they did. The other interesting thing is there was even a rental market for horses within the tribes. The horses were valuable property, and sometimes the owner of a horse might not be the best bison hunter. What could he do? He could go to the owner of the horse and actually work out a rental contract to rent the horse for a particular hunt. So once again, fairly well-established property rights, not necessarily property rights in the same sense that we would think of, but fairly effective property rights in terms of governing the West. The Native Americans were moved to reservations. They had to adapt their particular techniques to being on reservations. Some of those times that was not a particularly kind way to treat them in terms of their local culture, but they adapted pretty well. But the main problem was, on the reservations, much of the land is held in what we call trust. It's held in trust by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. What does trust mean? It means you have the land to use, that in order to use it fully, you have to get permission of the BIA. Because they're the ones who really own the land. It was a very paternalistic system. It did not really respect the dignity of the Native Americans. But the trust land, and on reservations across the West, some land is held privately by the tribe as a whole, or by individual members of the tribe, and some of it is held in trust. Do property rights make a difference? Yes. Trust land on the reservations in the West is somewhere between 40 to 90% less productive than what we would call the fee simple land, the land that is held fully, that is free and clear by the Native Americans. The trust lands come out of the Dawes Act of 1887 and the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. And so again, incentives make a difference, property rights make a difference. Top-down control also led, by the way, there was some amount of trading that did go on the frontier between the Native Americans and the Euro-American settlers. Another Charlie Russell's painting, this is called the toll. This guy's holding up a finger, maybe not the one you're thinking of, but he's holding up a finger saying, if you guys go through here, you've got to pay a toll. Why? Because we have property rights. Property rights recorded in the courthouse? No. But pretty clear property rights. If they thought they owned the land, these people are trespassing, they want payment for it, and you can see in the background there, the cowboys are cutting out a steer or some steers to pay the toll. However, as time went on, the army came to the frontier, and once the army was there, the calculations changed for the settlers. Before there were army posts, and there was conflict between the Native Americans and the settlers, and you wanted to get involved in conflict, you had to organize a militia. There was no military. But after the Civil War, there was a standing army, and the army was at the post. That changed the calculation a lot. And if you think about when did the major, what we would call atrocities or battles that took away rights from the Native Americans, they occur in the latter part of the 19th century. There were a few before that, but most of them were post-Civil War, because the standing army changed the calculus for the settlers. A famous journal article, Raid or Trade, and the two authors, Terry Anderson and Fred McChesney, argue that once you get the standing army, the Native Americans are more likely to be raided, to have property taken from them, rather than to be traded. Another thing that made a difference was the rank of the particular officers. Now this is probably a bit of a caricature. It's the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876. You're a long ways from that. I don't know if anybody's ever made it on a family trip to the Battle of the Little Bighorn in southern Montana. It doesn't quite look like this. The battle is spread up over 5 or 6 miles up and down the Little Bighorn River. But this is supposedly a picture of General George Armstrong Custer, who was one of the foolish ones that rode into battle. Now the interesting thing is, first of all, he was a fool, and he operated without great information. But the other interesting thing was his rank. His rank was what was called a brevet general. Brevet rank means you have temporary rank because of conflict. And that rank was granted to officers in the Civil War when many of the officers were shot and they needed new officers. So they would promote somebody to a higher rank. But it was called brevet rank, and you could only maintain that rank as long as there was the potential for armed conflict. General George Armstrong Custer was a brevet general. In order to maintain his generalship, he needed a certain amount of conflict. So that changed the incentives in terms of his willingness to enter into battle. He also had really bad information, and he was probably somewhat foolhardy. Oops, I did that before, and now I've got to go back and figure it out. I put the wrong button there. So, see if I can keep my button straight. What about other places where there would be potential conflict? In 1848, gold is discovered at Sutter's Mill in the Sierra Nevadas, and so now you get people rushing into the area into California in order to engage in gold mining. This is called sluice mining. You're shoveling gravel into these troughs, and then you're running water down them. And there's little pieces of stick that are nailed to the bottom, and you run water down there, and since gold is heavier than the gravel, you just shovel gravel in, and then you divert the water, and it comes down there, and you'll be able to collect your gold at the end of the day. Now there's gold deposits all through the Sierra Nevadas. People rushed in to there to create mining camps in an effort to try to get the gold. What was it like? Well, one of the predictions was that this is going to be a place in which it's going to be terrible. There's going to be anarchy, bloodshed, strife. The law will be powerless. Rights will be disregarded. Reason dethroned. Brute force will reign triumphant. Was that the case? No. Each mining camp wrote its own set of rules. Those rules were specific to that particular area. The size of the claim depended on how productive it was in terms of gold. The person that first discovered it got a double or a triple claim. There were rules about how you staked your claim, what you had to do to prove property rights to it. There were rules about how often you had to work it, because one of the questions in the mining camp was, did the guy that owned this claim pull up stakes and go someplace else? So you had to work it regularly. So this quote is simply not true. A guy has looked at the mining camp rules for all through the Sierra Nevadas, and it turns out they were quite orderly sorts of places to be. Now they didn't have jails because it was too expensive to try to keep somebody in jail because everybody was busy mining. So if they caught somebody that they thought was claim jumping, the cry would go through the camp, claim jumper, claim jumper. And everybody would run to a central gathering place and they'd have a jury trial, present evidence about whether this was an actual violation of the mining claim or not. And they'd get out the rules, which were written down, and they'd say, you violated these or you didn't. And the guy could make a defense. No, he was taking the claim over from somebody else. So it was a reasonably orderly place, even though they were all armed. Many of them came from different backgrounds. So it was a place in which I would say order reigned rather than chaos. What about the wagon trains, the moving of people west? Between 1840 and 1860, 300,000 people crossed the Great Plains. That's a lot of people. And they crossed. It was too dangerous to go across by yourself in terms of possible Indian depredation, or particularly in terms of just protection from the elements. So they would organize themselves in the wagon trains. Again, no government. It seemed like it would be a place where you'd see chaos, people, wagon trains attacking other wagon trains, trying to take them over, take their resources. Before they left their jumping off place, which was usually St. Joseph or St. Louis, Missouri, to hit the trail, and it was 4 to 6 months by wagon train to cross the plains, they were either going to the gold fields in California or to the Willamette Valley in Oregon, which was a place of productive agriculture. What happened? They wrote constitutions. They wrote contracts, and these contracts specified how the wagon train was organized, who had what authority, what the wagon train master could do, what you would do if the wagon train broke up, because sometimes it broke up and sometimes some of the property was owned in common. And so it was a place in which you had to decide how well would you be organized. John Philip Reed, very famous historian, has written about the wagon train era, this 1840 to 1860 period. And he says it was not a time of massive discord. He says the Overland Trail was not a place of conflict. More accurately, it was a place of settlement, and basically settlement of disputes. So another case study in which they were able to organize themselves in order to figure out how to get to solve those sorts of problems. One of the problems on the American West was what about the bison? Because they were all over the Great Plains. We're not sure how many. Nobody was out running the Great Census, but the estimates would say that probably in 1820 there were about 30 million bison. By 1870 we have a little more of a count. A lot of them had been killed, so there was only about 10 million in 1870. But by 1883 there were only 1,000. Interesting period of time. What happened? They were killed for the hides. The hides were taken off. The carcasses were left to rot. This is an interesting picture. Do you know what all those sorts of things are there?
Skulls.
Bison skulls. They're piled up at a railroad depot getting ready to be hauled. They're going to actually haul those skulls and make fertilizer out of them. The bones and skulls would be used for fertilizer. The usual argument with regard to the bison is that they were killed because it was a tragedy of the commons. Economists think of the tragedy of the commons as when you don't have property rights to a resource, what do? You rush out and you take it, and you take it very rapidly. And like the oceans, there's oftentimes a tragedy of the commons. Resources are owned in common. If you try to preserve a creature for the next generation, or for the next year, or for the next 5 years, you can't necessarily keep it. I've gone back to the environmental textbooks, and the bison is the second most used example of the tragedy of the commons. My work says that wasn't the case, that they would have been killed off even if they would have been owned. Why would they have been killed off even if they were owned? Because they were so hard to handle. This is the end of a trail drive, and you can see all these cowboys down here, and you can see the cattle back there. If this is a typical trail drive, there's 3,000 head of cattle. They worked with moving the cattle north from about 1860 to 1880. And they discovered that they could, it would take, 10 cowboys could move about 3,000 head of cattle north. And they could also then, once they were on the range, they could trail the cattle to market. And that turned out to be important because the first transcontinental railroad goes through in 1869. Other railroads come. What this means is it opens up the West as a production place for meat, and to produce meat for the eastern markets. But you had to get the meat to a railroad depot, to a railhead, in order to ship it to market. And so the question was how easy was to do it. Well, you could trail cattle to the railhead. You could not trail bison to the railhead. This is a picture of a moving of bison. Michael Pueblo, who was a Flathead Indian on the Flathead Reservation in northwestern Montana, captured some bison calves in the 1880s, put them in his bison herd. His bison herd grew until it got to be about 600 head. He realized that more and more settlement was coming to the Flathead Reservation. It was going to be difficult to try to maintain his bison herd, so he tried to sell it. And he wanted to sell them as live animals for people that might want to preserve the bison. And so he tried to sell them to the U.S. government. The U.S. government said no, but the Canadian government said, yes, we will take your bison, but you got to ship them to us. Ship them to us live by railroad. So, interestingly enough, here are these crates. There's a crate on each of these wagons being pulled by a few horses. You know what's in each crate? One live bison. Each crate is specially constructed, is padded on the inside, so they can get the bison moved to the railhead. They've actually captured them in a corral, and then they got them on the crates, and then they're going to ship them. They're going to get them on the railroad, and they're going to ship them to market. I have done the calculations for trailing cattle to the railhead or getting bison to the railhead, because you had to kill them and haul them, and you had to do it in the wintertime before, so the meat would not spoil. You have to do it again. I'm getting good at this. You get a pause every once in a while while I go back and make my system work. I got big thumbs. I hit too many buttons. My calculations say that it costs 21 cents per ton mile to get bison meat to the rail. It costs 1 cent per ton mile to get cattle to the rail. What does it mean? It means that bison weren't an economically productive resource. Now, they were very good. They were ecologically adapted. They were very good at converting grass to meat. And bison meat works pretty well. Then you've ever been to any of Ted's restaurants? It's called Ted's Montana Grill. He has a ranch just south of me and outside of Bozeman, and he raises bison on it. And bison are a perfectly fine meat. They're actually a little healthier, a little lower in cholesterol than beef. But what do these numbers mean? These numbers mean that it didn't pay to run bison on the plains. Instead, they replaced bison with cattle. So the killing off of bison was an economic activity. But surely that's not all we care about bison for. They're magnificent creatures. They have what economists would call amenity value or non-consumptive value. We would like to see them out there. We would like to see some of them around. Well, it turns out they were saved for that reason. Mostly private entrepreneurs. Some of them were saved on Yellowstone National Park. There was an original herd of 40 bison that were on the park. Now there's about 300,000 head of bison in North America. You can go to Custer State Park in South Dakota and go to view them. You can go to the National Bison Range in western Montana and look at them. You can go to Yellowstone National Park and see them. And you can go to several private ranches and see them. In August, I was a part of a conference at Ted Turner's Flying D Ranch. In the 1980s, Ted Turner bought an old-time cattle ranch. It ran about 3,000 head of cattle. He took all the cattle off, built a nice home. At that point, he was still with Jane Fonda. They built a nice home for himself and Jane and turned the ranch headquarters over to bison. And you can rent the ranch headquarters, usually when Ted is not there. He doesn't like to see people around. But you can rent the ranch headquarters for conferences, and we had a small conference. It has to be a small conference because he put a very strict conservation easement on the ranch, and he can't put up any more buildings. So 15 of us were there for 3 days, and when I looked out of my bunkhouse window on one morning, I saw 500 of these bison wandering around because Ted likes bison. And there now are preserved a substantial number of bison. So preserving bison for the economic market for meat did not make a lot of sense, but preserving it for the amenity value was a sensible sort of a thing to do. What about moving of cattle? What about trailing them? How easy was that? And that was a significant sort of an activity. Also, between 1866 and 1884, 5 million head of cattle were moved north. It's the largest domestic move of livestock anywhere in history. You've never seen anything like it. This required all sorts of innovative contracting. As I said before, it was about 10 cowboys and a cook that drove the mess wagon, and he was responsible for setting up camp each day. You probably trailed the cattle 20 miles a day. The earlier photograph, or earlier painting that I gave you of Charlie Russell, you can see the cattle being trailed over a long distance back there. So they figured out how to do that. It took a lot of innovative contracting. To start with, it was pretty risky to give your cattle to somebody to drive north. So the drover, a drover company, would actually buy the cattle, would drive them north and sell them. Why? Because it was too hard to write a contract that took care of the risks on the trail. It was also interesting in terms of trying to write a contract that dealt appropriately with the cowboys. You might think that's a romantic sort of a thing to drive cattle north for 3 months. It turned out to be a pretty long, dirty, dusty ride. It was not the sort of a job that people would necessarily want to sign on for, the labor contract usually gave you a certain amount to start the journey, but you had to be there at the end to get the end of to get your final payment. Why? Because they understood contracting. They understood how to write incentive-compatible sorts of agreements. Here's a picture of the cattle trails. Many of them came out of Texas, went up to the Midwest, and right there is where my ranch was. PJ Ranch was in eastern Montana, kind of at the end of that cattle trail. We were close to, this is Montana, this is South Dakota, and this is Wyoming, so that's where my grandfather started and where our ranch started. This is Charles Goodnight, one of the people that was famous for trailing cattle north. You had to prove ownership of cattle, and so interestingly enough, in western states they developed branding as a way of proving ownership, and in each of the western states fairly early on, even in the territorial sorts of governments, they would have a statewide brand registration system that would determine what the brands are. This is my brand certificate. Notice that it's a PJ. It's registered with the state of Montana. It's a PJ on the left hip for cattle, and it's a PJ on the left shoulder for horses. What does that mean? It means that any animal in Montana that's branded with a PJ on the left hip belongs to me. And in fact, if you take your cattle to a sale barn and they've got a PJ on them, what are they going to do? They're going to send the check to me because the guy at the sale barn has a brand book. Unless you have a bill of sale from me that says that I have transferred the cattle to you. There actually are some cows in Montana with a PJ on them. They belong to Ron Clampine, and he's got the bill of sale very safely ensconced, so when he goes to sell them, he can prove that they're his rather than somebody else's. Well, we get pretty good at this, right? So, here's actually my brand on my barn. And we're rounding up cattle in the spring of the year for the spring branding. And here's another picture of branding on the open on the range. Another question, what about the open range? Because much of the land couldn't be homesteaded. The Homesteading Act, first passed in 1862 and modified several times after that, was not particularly suited to the West. It was a top-down institution that didn't reflect of arid conditions of the American West. So much of the range wasn't owned. So the question was that a tragedy of the commons? Did the cowboys basically just run cattle all over the place? Was there a way of limiting access to the range? There actually was. This is a roundup. You can see that there's a herd of cattle being sorted out back here. There's a cowboy that's bringing out a steer right there. That's actually a pretty good cutting horse. You can tell that he's setting his feet. This steer is starting to cut to the right, and that horse is setting his feet, and he's going to make that cut with him. If you're riding a good horse, you don't even have to rein them to do that. They'll see that animal cut, and they'll make that cut with you. One of my delights is in the spring of the year, for the last few years, I just sold my cattle herd, but prior to that, another guy and I would have all of our cattle together for the winter, and then we would spend a half a day in the spring cutting out all of the PJ cattle so I could run them separately. And if you were riding a good horse, if you're riding a bad horse, it's very frustrating. If you're riding a good horse, it's a delight. And my horse Misty finally, after doing it for a couple, 3 years, picked up on what we were doing and became a nice, useful part of it. But the roundups were the means of solving the tragedy of the commons problem, the tragedy of the open range. You were not granted access to the roundup, and every about 10 to 12 different ranches would get together and round up. They would round up once in the spring in order to brand the cattle out of the young calves, and then round up in the fall to cut out the beeves that they were going to trail to market. And they used customary range rights to determine the access to the range. And they basically decided, they divided it up, said how much range you have. In the 1880s, Teddy Roosevelt, he was 1886, Teddy Roosevelt was in the Dakota Territory. He bought a ranch that had range rights for 600 head of cattle. And Teddy announced that he was going to run 1,200 head of cattle. The next day, 3 ranchers were standing on the front porch of Teddy's ranch home, and they said, Mr. Roosevelt, you bought your ranch and you have the right to run 600 head of cattle. That's the customary right. There was no legal sort of prohibition, but the customary prohibition, and if he didn't obey, he would not be allowed access to the twice yearly roundup. So the roundup was a way, again, of an incentive compatible set of bottom-up institutions that worked pretty well. This picture is interesting because I think that's me back there, the herd holder. From the age of about 10 to 18, we would go to a neighbor's ranch where several brothers had all the cattle together, and we would cut cattle all day. And at that age, my job was to be the herd holder, which was one of the boring jobs. You sat out there for an hour on end, just hoping that maybe some of these cattle would take off to the hills, and then you could get your horse after them. Otherwise, you just sat there and rode back and forth, and the real cowboys were out here in the middle of the herd cutting it. And you waited and waited until you got to be old enough to be able to do that. They also had line camps. Line camps were a way of enforcing your property rights. This is a chart. This is an L.A. Hutman photograph. They would put the line camps along the customary lines between ranches, and that was another way of enforcing your rights. They developed barbed wire. It was too costly to fence in the American West with rail fences. There wasn't much stuff around that you could use for fences. So they developed property rights by virtue of barbed wire. And Joseph Glidden invented barbed wire in DeKalb, Illinois in 1873. In a few years, there were thousands of miles of fencing that was made available. I talked about institutions that had worked fairly well. There were some institutions that didn't work so well. This is a picture of a homestead claim, a 160-acre claim. In 1862, Congress passed the Homestead Act. You had to go live on the land for 5 years, and you had to farm a portion of it, and it was called free land. They put all of their possessions out here. This is which is called a sod house. They just stacked up sod there. I think it's interesting that they have the cow on the roof, and they have a bunch of their possessions out on their dining room table. They've got their team there. Historians see the Homestead Act as a time that gave people free land. Land was given away free. However, it wasn't free. So you had to race for it. Suppose that the dean says, you know, out of this lecture fund that we have to bring people in, we've got an extra $500. So next week, on Wednesday morning at 8 o'clock, if you show up outside of the dean's office, there will be 10 of you that can get, let's say it's more than $500, the 10 of you, the first 10 people in line can get a $500 check. Well, what's going to happen at 8 o'clock? Well, maybe somebody's going to be there at 7:30 to get the $500 check. But you know that your friend is going to be there at 7:30, so you get there at 6 a.m. But you know she's going to be there at 6 a.m., so when do you get there? You get there at 6 o'clock the night before. Outside the dean's office, these are people in their sleeping bags trying to get the $500 check. How much are you willing to spend to get $500? Well, you might be willing to spend $400 to get $500. You would sit in line long enough until you would dissipate almost all of the gain of the money, the $5,000 that would go to the first 10 people to line up. That is what homesteading was like. Homesteading was betting against the weather, against the elements, to try to be there early enough so that you could get your property. And in fact, so it was a race for property rights. And in some areas, 80% of the homestead claims didn't prove up. There were some actual races. There was what was called the Cherokee Strip in Oklahoma. And the Cherokee Strip in Oklahoma was an area that was deeded to the Cherokee Indians when they were moved out of the southeast, not willingly. It was what's called the Cherokee Trail of Tears. But they had a big strip of land in Oklahoma. They eventually sold it to the federal government, and the federal government made it available for homesteading. But by this point, settlement had gone long past the Cherokee Strip, so people knew that it was a valuable piece of property. You had to stand in line in order to get a certificate to engage in the race. And about 10,000 people stood in line. 9 people died standing in line in order to get the certificate for the race. On September 16, 1893, soldiers were staged every 600 yards along the northern edge of the Cherokee Strip and along the southern edge. A gun went off and people raced for the land. And this is called the Oklahoma Land Rush. In fact, the Oklahoma Sooners, a football team, is named after the people that got there sooner than they were supposed to. It's interesting because the race used up lots of resources. One guy counted 40 racehorses that collapsed and died from exertion in the first few miles. Now, it was different from homesteading because it was concentrated in a short period of time. But the homesteading era that lasted until 1934 was a race for property rights. And it was a top-down set of rules, a set of rules that did not necessarily work well. There was some fraud involved. The first Homestead Act said that you had to build a house 12 by 14. They did not write into the legislation what the measure of 12 by 14 was. So this guy's saying, I've got my homestead house of 12 by 14. That was changed fairly soon. But the Homestead Act was very expensive. It imposed a land system upon the West that didn't work. It was 160 acres until 1909 when they changed it to 320 acres. And then in 1914 they changed it to 640 acres. So the maximum you could get by a homestead was 640 acres, which is 1 square mile, one section. Just to show you how inappropriate that was, my family we owned 5,000 acres and we rented another 20,000 that had never been homesteaded from the government. So our family ranch was 25,000 acres. If you want to know what that is in square miles, it's 9 miles by 5 miles. So one of my abilities is building things. Spent a lot of my lifetime building things. Well, I started with a family picture, so I'll end with a family picture. This is a picture of my wife and our 2 dogs. Oh, no, that's not quite it. Actually, my wife doesn't see much humor in that because I took her back to eastern Montana to live, and she thought that the living conditions might not have been all that different from that sort of a situation. I was telling people at lunch that one of my first activities with my wife was to try to teach her about riding horses. So I took her on the drive and we drove bulls 20 miles over a 12 or 14-hour period, far away from any civilization at all. That was her first and her last horseback. Okay, what can we learn from this from the West? First of all, conflict is negative sum. People would like to solve the problem of conflict. Cooperation is positive sum. That's what we mean by economic traits, by economic activity. We produce wealth by virtue of producing and exchanging, and bottom-up institutional change, not in every case, but bottom-up institutional change can produce a reasonable amount of order and gains from trade. And that's what the story of the West is all about. You don't want conflict, you want cooperation, you want institutions that will facilitate that. So, the not so wild, wild West, my answer is, it wasn't so wild. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions.
Questions? Or comments? Disagreements?
I really want to let the students ask questions, but how do you explain the fact that we do eat buffalo meat today? Has something made it much cheaper?
Well,
Obviously,
it is.
it's more expensive than beef.
It is. If you go to the American Bison Association webpage, you will find that they tell you that it will cost you about twice as much to produce bison as it does cattle. So there are ranchers that do it, but you've got to pay a premium for it. Ted Turner puts it in his restaurants. It's available in other sorts of places. At one point, I was able to go to Ted Turner's buffalo handling facilities, and they're amazing. For somebody that grew up handling cattle, we would have a corral fence about this high and would hold cattle. These were welded steel corrals that were about 8 or 9 feet high. So it's a much more expensive sort of a proposition. You can also truck them. You can put them in trucks and haul them. For the first 60 years, you needed to be able to trail them because trucks going to ranches in order to haul the beef to market or haul whatever your product is to market didn't come until the 1930s or 1940s. One of my sorrowful memories was when I was 5 or 6 years old, they were getting ready to trail the cattle to market. It was was going to be a 3-day ride. I got my horse, saddled it, went out with my dad and the other cowboys, did the first day of trail, and I was convinced that I would be sleeping out underneath the stars that night and making the next 2 days of drive. And lo and behold, Mom showed up in a car. And she said, "Your horse is just going to follow along with the cows and the herd, and you're going home." I was heartbroken. I thought, surely I was, at the age of 5, wasn't anything wrong with making a 3-day trip, but they didn't think so. So basically, until the 1930s and 40s, they were still trailing the meat to market. And so that's what made bison so much more expensive, because you could not trail them to market. Other questions? I know Indiana's a long ways from Montana, so maybe a world that you don't want to think about or talk about. It's a different sort of a place.
So,
Yes.
I remember, perhaps I remember it wrong, but the government had put out an order to kill all the buffalo just to destroy the way of life for the Indians.
That's a story that the Army actually wanted to kill off the bison in order to make it harder for the Native Americans to survive. There's really not much evidence for that. It does appear that sometimes they might have provided ammunition to some of the buffalo hunters. But it's interesting because in Canada, which also had bison herds, and there was certainly no effort by the Army there, they were also killed off. So the Army might have had some impact on that, but most of it was killing them for hides. In the 1870s, a German invented or came up with a way to bison hide is very different than cattle hide. It's much tougher. And so in the 1870s, in Germany, they came up with a process for tanning bison hides that made it compatible with cattle hides for commercial use. Hides were mostly used for belting for industrial purposes, great big belts that would run machines. And so then in the 1870s was when the killing of the bison really started, and it was driven by the economics of the hide hunt. So yeah, it has, you're right, that appears in history. I've tried to go back and figure out. The Army itself didn't kill off. They would send out somebody to hunt bison for the local post. They would not kill them en masse. Could have had a small influence, but overall I don't think it was a major influence. It was an economic activity.
All right. Dr. Hill would be happy to take questions privately if you want to talk to them after this talk. We have food that is there, so please, stay around and have something to eat. Please, again, join me in thanking Dr. Hill.